Yeah, I'm excited to share the kind of some ongoing work, but at this point, a lot of results from an extensive review of green infrastructure plans in US cities. As soon as I get my screen shared to you, you will see more of what I'm talking about. And so I'm excited to see how, both how cities themselves have been dealing with some of the issues you talk about. That we all value, I think many of us in the watershed world value green infrastructure. And I was also told my audio is cutting out, so I'll stop my video if that's all right. Hopefully that helps. So our task, which I'll get into here, has been to examine how cities are essentially planning for green infrastructure in the real world. The work that I'm presenting today has been performed in collaboration with folks at the New School, namely Timon McPherson, as well as many folks at Cary who you are probably familiar with, including Stuart Pickett and Peter Groffman, and then colleagues at the EPA and now at North Carolina State, Dr. Fuchsia Hoover, and at Arizona State, Dr. Sarah Miro. I was told by my friend Mike Jastrzemski that this was the omelet talk. I meant to throw in a picture of one of my favorite omelets. Sadly, that didn't make the presentation, so I hope you forgive me for not going on with the theme of eggs, but hopefully green infrastructure is sufficient to nourish the brains for this morning, at least.
Green eggs and ham.
Yeah, I won't make you eat green eggs and ham, but we will have green infrastructure. And I'm more of a bacon guy, but what can you do? The idea that nature provides many services has been around in various forms for a long time. Green infrastructure has emerged as a kind of dominant concept for this kind of the current iteration of that idea. And it's a dominant approach for addressing urban climate and sustainability challenges. However, as many of you are probably thinking right now, green infrastructure means very different things to different people. Just to kind of showcase some of the diversity of these things, we have, up on the upper left here, we have more or less intact riparian ecosystems, large ecological networks, landscape scale ecological processes that are sought to be protected through a large, a landscape scale planning concept. Below that, we have many attempts to restore those types of systems, various efforts at stream, river, wetland restoration, landscape restoration that seek to improve connectivity, restore these landscape scale ecological processes. And these are often, approaches require large scale planning. When you look at a city level, in the center bottom panel, you have Atlanta, Georgia. You can start to kind of look at the green armature of the city, and as this concept has been translated into urban planning, it has informed park system planning, streetscape, larger efforts at connecting urban ecosystems across the urban fabric. But in practice, especially as promulgated by Clean Water Act regulations under the auspices of the EPA, you have a lot more of what looks like in the top center here, where you have specific facilities, rain gardens, bioswales, planters, street side trees, etc. You have very small, relatively small installations that may or may not be integrating into this ecological network. And as you dig even deeper into practice, the stormwater control methodology on the upper right here is, labeled as green infrastructure, but in practice is mostly gray with some green elements. To add some complexity to this, as in the bottom right, we also have many relic infrastructures, such as this abandoned or, currently dewatered CNO canal stretch near Great Falls in Potomac, Maryland, where we have this understanding and emergence of post-industrial landscapes as harboring novel ecologies that provide novel sets of services to human residents as well as ecological actors. So in my book, green infrastructure is all of these things. And the question is really, what's green about it? To add more complexity in the common discourse, in the sort of popular way that green infrastructure is being discussed, we also see things popping up like renewable energies, bike paths, sort of alternative transit technologies. And the question becomes, what is actually green about green infrastructure? On the extreme end of this question, we have an ongoing debate that many of you are probably familiar with around nuclear power as being, the only way to address the climate crisis, which has been kind of the position officially taken up by one of my former employers at the Breakthrough Institute. And this, this question of exactly what is green about green technologies is kind of at the forefront of a lot of our minds when we start to look at just the magnitude of the climate crisis that we're having to address on a fairly shrinking timescale. And to add a little bit more to the pot on GI, there is also this kind of legacy of the romantic idea of nature informing, I think, a lot of landscape ecology and conservation planning, especially in the United States, where nature is seen as something sublime, an ideal object that can exist in harmony, Daniel Botkin notwithstanding, that exists kind of, in its purest state outside of human influence. And the question becomes, how do you reconcile this idea of a nature pure and sublime and self-harmonizing with an infrastructural approach? I think for me, the kind of a lot of the crystallizing thinking, the clarifying thinking has been following the work of indigenous scholars. And sorry, a screenshot here apparently caught the mute sign. And some recent work by a colleague at the New School, Claudia Tomateo, makes the case that indigenous landscape technologies, especially using the case study of Peru, going back to time immemorial, really are the backbone of contemporary green infrastructure systems. And if we extend this thinking across, the world, and especially settler colonial states, what we have is an ecological infrastructure, what we could even call a critical ecological infrastructure that has sustained human civilization since time immemorial, that is currently being rapidly transformed by various contemporary infrastructure projects. As you can see on the left here, the sort of indigenous land defenders at Unistoten Village have long kind of maintained that nature is their critical infrastructure, and they have a sacred duty and an obligation to protect it from fossil fuel infrastructure development. So for me, these aren't just kind of conceptual struggles over what constitutes ecological infrastructure or green infrastructure, but these are often matters of life and death involving the deepest kind of aspects of political struggle. To return to the kind of conceptualization of it though, I think we need to also get beyond this kind of nature as romantic ideal or as system that provides services to humankind without much human input. And some other work with colleagues back in 2016, Lawrence Jones and others, and published in Land Use Policy, will make the case that most of these systems that we derive ecosystem services from are actually co-produced through various forms of human-derived capital. As we can see in this figure, the potential ecosystem services that feed into the potential supply really, not only do they come from cultural landscapes that form these underlying socioecological systems, but they also require human-derived capital to realize the service flow. If you think about this in terms of many of the kind of ecosystem services you personally enjoy, you might think of, how do you get to your favorite trailhead? Or how do you get to your favorite kayak or canoe launch? Or how do you interact with the streetscape or the park system? Generally, there are various forms of hard infrastructure or human-built infrastructure required to even access or use those services. And the same could be said for things like food, drinking water, or other cultural services. For me, it's important to have this conceptual grounding because each of these ideas of how ecosystems work and therefore how green infrastructure works sets the stage for what green infrastructure actually does, what services it provides, where it can go, and for whom it is seen as desirable. So I know I was going to give you a talk on the equity of green infrastructure planning. And for me, this conceptualization of what GI is, does, and for whom is the foundation of any conversation around what equity and how equity and green infrastructure are related to one another. When we look at the academic literature on municipal green infrastructure, especially in the United States, we see that it generally focuses on limited case studies. There's a lot of work on single neighborhoods or cities or even policy contexts. And much of the research, as evidenced by one of my colleagues, Marissa Matzler, and a team looking at an extensive literature review, has found that the way that green infrastructure is used is often imprecise and actually has significant divergence. There is no real convergence around academic definitions of what green infrastructure is and does. We sought in our research team to basically provide insight on how urban plans in the US are dealing with the concept and implementing it. And we found a similar sort of diversity and hopefully a little bit more convergence than they did in the academic literature, which I'm going to share with you now, just to illustrate some of the diversity. Even within one, New York City's green infrastructure plan, you see a fairly large range of objects or types of GI being referred to, everything from permeable pavement. It's hard to see the ecology in there. I guess the geologists will see some environmental forces at play, certainly, but to see these things as part of a living system requires a little bit of the stretch of the imagination and to look at a slightly more physicalist rather than an ecological point of view. In our plan review, we tried to focus on a range of cities. Well, we focused on a range of ages, sizes, and tried to get broad geographical representation across the United States. We also included several known or recognized green infrastructure leaders, such as Milwaukee, Portland, Seattle, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Our goal was to look at plans that addressed green infrastructure, which is also a departure from previous approaches to deal with this question that focused on single plan types, such as sustainability plans or climate plans. We wanted to look across the planning system of the city and see how green infrastructure was being defined and planned for within all of those plans. This approach yielded a surprising diversity of plan types that address the idea of green infrastructure and try to implement it in practice. Our iterative search method basically started with either a sustainability or climate plan, and if those were lacking a comprehensive plan, and saw what other plans were referred to in the city planning system as dealing with green infrastructure. Those plans were then screened for if they actually dealt with GI or not. This figure basically displays what proportion of the plans that were referred to as dealing with green infrastructure actually contained the term. And they're sort of organized in terms of the consistency of actually addressing GI. And so not surprisingly, this column here on the left, GIP is green infrastructure specific plans, which has emerged as an entire novel planning domain within American cities, are completely consistent in actually containing the term. Combined sewer overflow plans came next with very high consistency rate. Sustainability planning, slightly less consistent. Comprehensive planning, even less. Watershed improvement plans, water system plans, kind of going down the scale. And then cities that we looked at who had these plans in their planning systems are organized from top to bottom. And so you can see a kind of a range of consistency in referring to plans that deal with GI and those actually do some planning for green infrastructure. From the plans that actually do refer to green infrastructure, we identified how do they define green infrastructure, using what concepts. Again, these are kind of the broad buckets that I gave you previously on either a landscape approach, a stormwater focused approach, or one that does try to integrate a variety of built infrastructure systems with urban ecological systems. What types of things they consider GI in terms of were these ecological elements, kind of hybrid designed ecological technological facilities, or purely materials and technology. And then what did it actually do? Was it functions, its core biophysical functions oriented towards a social purpose, an environmental purpose, or a technological purpose? And then what were the impacts of those functions? Were they primarily for society, for the environment, or for other technological systems? As you can see in this kind of summary figure, and we have a lot of subcategories that fit within these broad buckets. GI is kind of evenly split as a ecological and hybrid approach that does have non-insignificant amounts of materials and technology within it. The stormwater concepts really dominate, but there's also significant use of an integrative and a landscape concept, as well as a few other things that just don't fit any neat typological category. And the benefits of GI are primarily social, whereas the functions are primarily environmental. That being said, GI is also generally intended to provide benefits directly to the environment, as well as directly to the functioning of other technological systems, primarily sewer systems, but also such diverse things as building energy systems and transportation systems. For us, this meant that green infrastructure is no longer a purely ecological concept in practice. Rather, when we look at it in urban plans, these are referring generally to systems of interconnected ecosystems, hybrid engineered elements, and environmentally conscious technologies. These all provide contextual social, environmental, and technological functions. And contextual means in relation to one another. So when we're thinking about green infrastructure and urban planning, we're not just talking about green elements scattered across the landscape. We're now talking about how components of ecological, hybrid, and technological systems function in relation to one another in order to deliver their benefits. This approach merges pre-existing landscape definitions as well as the stormwater-focused definitions, which I could talk way too long about, the issues with the EPA's approach towards using GI. That merits a whole separate paper in and of itself, which I won't get into here, but I'm happy to talk about it down the line. Just to expand a little bit on the types, I won't spend time on this because I'm assuming you're all familiar. But we do see, I think pretty even split between using pure ecosystems and hybrid facilities. So really GI has become a hybrid ecological technological approach. And like I said before, functionally, GI is often functionally integrated into technological systems to provide environmental benefits. But we're also looking at society as the primary end goal for most green infrastructure's benefits. So what does this have to do with equity? I think the big thing to consider is that if GI is seen as primarily providing benefits, which we would see green infrastructure as providing amenity value, then both its functions and benefits in the urban landscape must necessarily interact with these uneven, often racist and class-based geographies of what makes urban space valuable. These areas of study have long been the focus for critical urban theory of dispossession, and this drives, I think, a lot of the discussion around the relationship between green infrastructure and gentrification and displacement. I think the other added element to this is that displacement often shifts risks around the urban communities. So while the intention is to add value to specific parts of the urban landscape, the outcomes also interact with the uneven geographies of urban risk and urban hazards, which has traditionally been the domain of environmental justice research. If GI is primarily seen as a hazard or risk management infrastructure, which I would include its stormwater management functions, then its functions primarily interact with this uneven geography of urban risk. And yet, since it's explicitly also trying to add benefits to the landscape, it also functions as an amenity, which then can accelerate these same processes of displacement and risk shifting that come from only a value-added approach. Those are two kind of mechanistic frameworks for understanding how GI exacerbates urban inequality. I think it's also worth stepping back, and especially given the Watershed Alliance's work on land return, is that these processes are occurring in the context of deep injustice. These take many forms and many are ongoing. And for me, the interesting thing to recognize as an immigrant to this country has been that the perceived severity of this injustice is often directly proportional to one's social position in relation to it. So the degree that you've been on the receiving end of these injustices are the degrees to which they figure in your psychology and your understanding of how the world works. And if you've been isolated or insulated from them your whole life or continue to be, then they may not seem like a big deal. They may seem like they're only historical factors and not present in the everyday world. This list is not exhaustive, but it's some of the larger ones that I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about how changing ecologies interacts with social justice. Includes land theft, ecological genocide, pure genocide, ideas of manifest destiny, chosen people, providential kind of land expansionism, related stolen labor, and the kind of ongoing legacies of slavery, the larger dynamics of imperialism, various forms of economic extractivism, including rentierism, continuing uneven development, their relationship with racism, white supremacy, how these interact with toxic chemical exposure, both from the extraction, the use, manufacturing, disposal of toxic chemicals, as well as the access to environmental goods, resources, and ultimately the control over futures, opportunities, and how finances circulate through the society. In this sense, these injustices are present in many senses. These injustices are present across the world. And while the United States is perhaps somewhat unique as a settler colonial project, it is not unique in its systemic use of violence and dispossession. These patterns have been unfortunately prevalent in human history. However, that idea, this perspective that society is necessarily combative, competitive, and expansionist is simply one narrative of how human civilization should evolve and take shape. Other forms of human existence are quite common, and for me, they generally make up the social reality of everyday life. This paradox is that love and care make oppression possible because oppressive societies can never sustain themselves. So it is our ability to tend and care for ecosystems that make their extraction and destruction possible. If the forces of hatred had already won, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. The environmental community, I think, and I'm hoping we can all consider ourselves part of that, has increasingly recognized that these forms of injustice correspond with patterns of infrastructure development and pollution. And I think many of us have been motivated to deal with the kind of impacts of industrial civilization. And environmental justice scholarship has made this bridge into the social realm and understood the uneven social patterns of environmental devastation. And many have recognized that infrastructure development in general has been a primary driver of these uneven impacts. We've had a much harder time, I think, reckoning with our own complicity in these kind of larger patterns of dispossession, colonization, and racism. And most of the critique of the environmental movement has come from outside the environmental community, and much of it has either been ignored for a long time or has been increasingly co-opted. And my hope is that it's increasingly now going to be acted upon. There are many examples of this. I've provided some links here. It's not really the focus, but I think in general, we need to recognize, in the urban setting especially, that parks in particular have been a tool of dispossession in diverse cities, as a now famous example of Seneca Village in Central Park, Fort Reno in Washington, D.C., as well as parks in Chevy Chase in Washington, D.C. And when we look at the history of parks design, these are not unique isolated incidences. These are actually core projects of urban renewal throughout the 20th century that used an urban sanitation agenda to displace particular undesirable communities to make space for others seen as more valuable. I think to kind of zoom back out, and I'm hoping you're seeing a little bit of a dynamic here that we're going from the specific back to the global, is that the overall goals of many environmentalists, and I would say including the goals of green infrastructure, have often been quite universalized. We see conservation, we see ecosystem services as providing universal benefits. And there's always been a tension between exterior forces pushing universal benefits and definitions of good against the actual realities of local communities. And this has been documented extensively by anthropologists such as Anna Tsing and Catherine Henshaw-Knott. Today, we actually exist in a very different world. Youth grassroots movements, many across the globe, have demanded fundamental transformations of societies, no longer content with Band-Aid fixes, and we are demanding justice in more ways than one. So the question to me becomes, how do we push for transformation at this kind of critical time? And if you look at the work of Zoltan Grossman and an edited volume from Lynn Davis, there are many instances of grassroots alliances coming together to kind of re-envision just ways of relating to landscapes. And the way that this connects to green infrastructure for me is that, like I was saying, we've often acknowledged that infrastructure has been a primary weapon of destruction of human communities as well as ecological communities. And the question becomes, how does making infrastructure green change those patterns, and does it at all? If we look at the kind of rise of modern environmental management as a turn towards creation of complexes of expertise, as anthropologists such as Ashley Kars and Bruno Latour have told us, are we really doing anything different by internalizing ecological processes into infrastructure modes of thinking, given that they generally require complexes of expertise, bureaucracy, coercive power, state authority to transform social ecological systems, often for the benefit of other humans that aren't actually resident on the landscape? These are also, have been bound up in larger narratives of progress and inevitability, which often fail due to their simplification of ecological systems, treating them as infrastructure, and often obsolesce themselves as society's demands or part of society's demands for what those systems do changes. This has always been inseparable from what many call a scientization of nature, or the creation of nature as an object of scientific study and a use or an understanding of nature only as data or only as signified objects, and not a visceral experience, a relationship with one participating in it. And in this sense, infrastructuralization and instrumentalization of nature requires that we are alienated from it and we look at nature as something to be managed rather than as an entity that we have an active relationship with. This is inseparable from technical expertise, especially knowledge of people in the territory. And this, what Scott calls legibility, has always been the tool of planning. Often, planning that seeks to do better, as Reese and other equity planners, and I think many folks in the watershed planning or restoration world see themselves as being tools of providing social benefit, or worse, as Oren Yiftashel, planning scholar in Israel, has pointed out, that planning often has a very dark side and is generally used as a tool of social control. The question for the equity of planning then is, if planning is a tool of realizing the future, whose future are we talking about? Who's going to create it and how? And when we're looking about complex systems, is how is that system going to be planned for and defined by whom and to what ends? This also invokes the questions of whose knowledge and whose experience will be used to construct these future plans. If representations of nature are always questions of power, and in a few places are representations of society, nature, and infrastructure relations, then how is planning going to encapsulate those complex relationships and try to change them into the future? And for us, the goal, given this kind of understanding that's been, again, studied from many different angles within the academic literature, was, can you condense this to evaluate the actual equity of green infrastructure planning? Not surprisingly, we created a rubric to do this. As we are wont to do in the academic world, we wanted to have a standard way of understanding the equity of a plan. And with all those kind of considerations in mind, we have three dimensions of equity planning that we look at. The first is the vision for equity within the plan. The second is the process of creating the plan and the processes set in motion by the plan, as well as the intended distributions of outcomes. And my computer is telling me my interconnection's unstable, so apologies if none of this is coming through as clear as it should be. This is forthcoming, or this is currently under review at Landscape and Urban Planning, so hopefully we can share this full manuscript with you later, and I'm happy to talk about this in questions, but I don't really want to spend too much time digging into it, besides saying that each of these broad dimensions of equity examines the definitions of equity, how equity and green infrastructure relationships are framed, how justice is discussed and framed, and the processes include the creation of the plan itself, the processes described for designing projects, communities, and projects, policies, and programs, how those things are actually intended to be implemented, and how they will be evaluated, if at all. The buckets for understanding outcomes and distributions primarily relate to those mechanistic frameworks I presented earlier in terms of how green infrastructure interacts with various urban hazards and risks, how it intends to alter the value of the landscape, and whose labor will be used at every stage of planning to implementation to monitoring the outcomes. When we screened the plans that we came up with, I think I forgot to mention, we came up with 122 plans across our 20 cities. We generally find a failure to really substantively engage with equity issues. There are some attempts to include communities in the early stages of planning, as you can see in the green bar in the process column in the middle for planning. But in general, the best practices are very few and far between when we look at including communities in the design, implementation, and evaluation of plans. To deal with just fundamental conceptualizations of equity, very, very few plans define it. Only about 11% of plans had any sort of definition at all. And of those, the majority were problematic and required some careful reevaluation. A few plans have essentially allowed affected communities to define equity and justice themselves, which, as I'll kind of dig into, is definitely the current best practice. But the other big takeaway from this, as seen in the central column under vision, is that many plans are attempting to frame some relationship between social equity issues and green infrastructure. This shouldn't be surprising given that the benefits of GI are primarily seen as social. So it's well understood that green infrastructure's end goal is to change society, The question is, how will it change society and for whose actual benefit? In line with a lot of, I think, popular discourse, the distributions of green infrastructure are one of the bigger focuses for how it interacts with equity, given that people recognize that there will be uneven impact to some extent, and the planners are actively trying to deal with this. But the problem is, without robust procedural equity, it's very difficult to have any, I think, real handle on, if the intended distributions are serving those who are going to be impacted by them. We find that these failures are common across all plan types that we looked at when we split it up by plan type. But we can see that some plans are more concerned with equity issues than others. So general comprehensive planning and open space planning is a little, and sustainability planning and climate planning are a little bit more attendant to concerns around social equity. The other big interesting thing here is that green infrastructure specific plans kind of ranked sort of third overall in their concerns for equity. We're much more on top of addressing equity issues than other types of purely stormwater planning, such as CSO long-term control plans and MS4 plans, despite the fact that every single green infrastructure specific plan we looked at was basically the derivative of a compliance-based process, a stormwater compliance-based process. So that gives me some hope in that, despite that, this turning nature into stormwater technology essentially does come with a larger basket of social concerns than pure stormwater management using traditional hard infrastructure approaches. The difference between cities is quite striking. Denver, Portland, Baltimore are all much more kind of concerned with equity issues, spend a lot more time discussing it, a lot more analysis is going into their programs around the social impacts. Portland's climate plan and comprehensive plan have much more robust initial public consultation processes. Denver had a lot of mechanisms for community-based design and also includes some mechanisms for community-based evaluation. But in general, you can see that across their planning systems, cities are also highly variable in how they address equity concerns. So you'll have best practices in one plan coexisting alongside very problematic approaches in another plan that are both dealing with green infrastructure, albeit different aspects. You might be asking, what does this mean for how cities actually implement green infrastructure? Plan is a plan. What does it mean on the ground? That's something we love to dig into. And as part of that process, we're examining what siting criteria they use to site projects and facilities. This is some work with Fuchsia Hoover and Sarah Miro. When we look at the siting criteria, the dominant concerns have been largely hydrological as well as logistical, but we also see that specific types of communities themselves are very much targeted for green infrastructure interventions. So equity-wise, this kind of asks, who wants to be targeted without their consent? If there's procedural weakness in how green infrastructure is being implemented, then how is targeting some communities going to derive benefit from? And I think this kind of supports a lot of other findings in the literature that there is a real risk of gentrification displacement through these types of planning processes. To kind of summarize the takeaways from all the plan review is that we really do need to very clearly define equity and justice, and that those definitions need to come from the impact of communities themselves. No one can decide what is equitable or just for somebody else. This also requires planning processes to be run by communities for communities. Agencies and NGOs must provide the necessary resources and supports for communities to really be the leaders, not just participants in planning, but to define the scope of it and the intended impacts and how those outcomes will be evaluated. In a larger sense, to deal with the kind of swirling constellation of injustice that I mentioned previously, is that GI will only be equitable within a larger framework of just transition and transformative justice, that we need to evolve the governance systems of urban systems more broadly to make GI equitable at the appropriate scale. Our future work that we're looking at is basically trying to get beyond, this tendency for a lot of equity and GI work to fix race in place that often uses a framing of deficit, that minoritized communities are somehow lacking in nature. Earlier empirical analysis shows that this isn't necessarily the case. Rather, we need to look at, changes in urban systems over time and think more critically about, what type of nature we have access to, what type of green cover counts as GI in relation to the actual planning system. We also need to deal with these kind of paradoxes of representation in that when a lot of equity, procedural equity focuses on, the demographics of people involved in planning in coarse ways, and that might not necessarily be representative of the actual communities being impacted. I'm going to close with a few principles here on how to consider the justice of nature-based infrastructures. In particular, I think this is just basically summarizing a lot of the things that I've talked about today. But at a minimum, when we're considering the justice of an approach towards green infrastructure, we need to consider 5 things. And these are the legacies and the current practices of displacement by infrastructure systems themselves, which to me invokes the relationship between green infrastructure, green gentrification, displacement, as well as the legacies and the current practices of oppressed and marginalized communities being made more vulnerable to natural hazards through various policy mechanisms. This is, we'll get into this in a little bit, but in the United States, there's a strong of restrictive zoning and racist financing, otherwise known as redlining, that has really made some communities much more exposed than others. We also need to consider the systemic risks of infrastructure failing and who is impacted when infrastructure systems do not perform the way that they were designed to or supposed to, which has also disproportionately affected marginalized and oppressed communities. There's also this added dimension of the displacement of the hazards themselves onto marginalized and oppressed communities by ongoing processes of urban development, land development, as well as poor land management and infrastructure itself. So not only is, these are all related points, but I want to just make it clear that when we look at point 1, we're talking about the actual physical footprint of infrastructure development. When we're looking at 4, we're looking at how those developments hazards around the landscape. The other big thing that we need to consider is the uneven vulnerability caused by the very structure of hazard mitigation policies, as well as their implementation and their inseparability from these uneven racist real estate markets. So these are all intersectional concerns. I'll give you a little bit more detail on each one to kind of highlight how they function differently. This work has been largely focused on flooding across the United States, and we're going to continue to develop this. I'm happy to talk about this at the end. Well, but to put a fine point on this idea of who is affected by current infrastructure systems, I'd already shared the Pixlone plan map for Hudson, but if you put it up again here, you can see that there's been significant displacement of, or if you know the background of this, you know that there's significant displacement of indigenous communities all throughout the Dakotas from relatively fertile river bottom farms and longstanding farming communities by large reservoirs. So flood protection for one person involves inundation for another. And we see that all around the world with mega dam development, but it's not unique to the United States. In terms of the impact kind of manufactured vulnerability or the dimension of manufactured vulnerability, redlining does serve as a classic example. New Orleans is an example of a classic example, but that essentially, certain communities were given very little choice or given no choice except to reside in certain areas that were more flood prone. When you look across the US, such as recent work by Collins et al., these patterns are quite heterogeneous. There's a lot of luxury development in floodplains. So we really need to dig into the kind of nuance of why people inhabit more hazard prone areas. But that is a key question to be asking when we're talking about managing hazards with green infrastructure. What is the history of the creation of that vulnerability, not just the current snapshot in time? The other big thing, again, flooding focused example, is that we have systemic risks of infrastructure failing that primarily affect marginalized and oppressed communities. From notable dam failures in West Virginia to this big one on the Buffalo Creek Dam, you can see that people who live downstream of large dams are often, who live in the zone of dam failures, are often the ones that have also been on the historical receiving end of many other forms of social injustice. I think this can also be true for, true for sewer systems in cities. This is true for green infrastructure systems in cities, that who's going to be impacted by these systems when they fail? That's a key question to be asking yourself as a green infrastructure planner. And the other thing is, how are those risks shifting over time? You're all here with, ongoing urban development at the watershed scale does increase flood magnitudes downstream. So communities that may have settled in places that weren't particularly flood prone at the time of their initial development may now be much more flood prone than previously, not due to anything done by that community themselves, but due to larger scale decisions around land management and infrastructure development. And so the question for the green infrastructure practitioner becomes, how am that I'm managing affected by larger scale processes? And what influence can I have on those? Trying to address them here at the end of pipe. And lastly, the uneven vulnerability caused by the structure and implementation of hazard mitigation policies. There's been a lot of good recent work on how both the community rating system and the funds available for being engaged in planning to improve community ratings have many problematic aspects. The University of Minnesota has done some great work and continues to do great work on that. We've also seen the same thing with federal bio programs that generally made much more accessible to certain communities than others due to a complex of historical factors. So the question, again, for the green infrastructure practitioner is communities that I'm working with, when they're looking at policies that provide funds for engaging these programs, do they reproduce or do they alleviate these current dynamics? To move towards more just and equitable green infrastructure, I think we need to keep those things in mind, but also a few generative principles. So in addition to having questions kind of in the back of your mind when you're thinking about green infrastructure, watershed, ecological restoration planning, here's some positive things you can focus on in your work. For me, is to respect socio-ecological pluralism and self-determination. And to me, that means acknowledging and supporting a diversity of approaches for caring for and restoring socio-ecological systems. There's not necessarily going to be just one right approach. And it's not just because of differences in human opinion, but it's also in differences of the opinion of ecological agents themselves. That might sound to some of you, but I think there's a growing recognition that in ways of relating to ecological entities that respect their individuality, agency, and personhood, are actually when engaging in restoration work, because we're not just simply managing the system or fighting the system or forcing it to conform to a particular predetermined ideal. We're actually working with it as a collaborator, and in some instances, even as a co-conspirator at restoring an ecological process in a badly damaged landscape. The second big principle is going beyond this idea. I think there's a lot of emphasis on participatory planning, inclusive planning, including communities to be impacted, basically bringing people to the table. And there needs to be a lot more emphasis and thought as to what is the nature of the table? Where is it? What room is it in? Is that even and going beyond those types of questions, we need to start transferring resources to communities to be their own experts and run their own planning processes. This entails planning in the service of communities. And this, like I was kind of mentioning before, their concerns must be central, regardless if they completely align with the green infrastructure agenda. So questions of housing, policing, and other environmental concerns that may only seem initially loosely related to green infrastructure planning need to actually be the focus of those planning efforts. I know that might sound strange, and there's been a lot of work on how environmental NGOs have a hard time recognizing that the concerns of communities need to actually be central. But I think you'll find you'll get a lot more mileage for your programs if you take into account the concerns of the communities you're trying to impact a priori, rather than trying to fold them into a pre-existing agenda. The other big principle to consider is that justice must include both recognizing the harm and recognizing that people have been harmed. And that's already being done by the communities that have been harmed. I'm sorry. There's an ecological in the background of the lawnmower. And that but that we recognize that those people have also been harmed, and that harm isn't going to be possible until the systems that cause it have been transformed. I'll wrap all of this up with saying, don't be afraid to think outside the box. Working these and acknowledging these harms and thinking through different end goals for green infrastructure and ecological planning may yield approaches that you wouldn't have been able to consider on your own. So in terms of generative ecological solutions, I think these types of recognizing the pluralism, the agency of ecological systems, the inherent right to self-determination of human and non-human communities, going beyond inclusion, and making justice, transformative justice central, will yield completely different approaches to solving these long-standing environmental challenges than what we see in the current arena. So thank you very much for paying attention. I'm sorry if I was cutting out at any point. I am more than happy to have as robust a discussion as we can, given the limitations of Zoom, and I will stop the share. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas for collaborations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. You wrapped up a lot into a very short period of time. So a reminder for all of our participants here that we've got the Q&A box. If you have questions, please go ahead and type those in. And while you're doing that, I'll just reflect that it was really interesting to see that in that list of types of plans that consider equity, that watershed planning and water system planning was down at the very bottom. So the plans least likely to include equity and green infrastructure are our very own watershed and water resource plans. And so I think that really speaks to the work that we have to do. And really thank you for bringing these issues to our community's attention and make sure that we have some ideas to move forward in a way that's more equitable and just.
This was a great presentation. Thank you. There's a tendency to listen to your presentation and feel very guilty. That this hasn't gone well and that a lot has been a failure. You've gestured to a few communities that have kind of stood above the pack. Are there any that are local? Have you been here in New York long enough to have a familiarity with any good local examples where it's being done well?
That's a great question. I know there's some ongoing collaborations in Yonkers and in the lower Hudson to really kind of change how these planning processes work. I'd love to hear more about successful examples. I know Syracuse has done a lot of work doing, kind of ecological restoration with an eye towards benefiting historically, disproportionately impacted communities. I think there's a lot of tension in those efforts, and I think you bring up this idea of guilt and shame, and I think there's a tendency, especially in the kind of Christian-dominated society, to use shame and guilt as motivating factors to initiate behavioral change. That's definitely not my intention. So, but I think it's to me, the feeling of guilt or the feeling of shame really is there to kind of spur some introspection and to spur like a change in thinking and a change in action. But yes, that's the one part of that answer.
We could use the word regret, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's healthy, though. So I would just close on saying that is healthy, and I think there are many efforts underway that are kind of actively evolving. And so, my intention is really to kind of inform and spur those things to continue to take these concerns into account.
Yeah, we've got a question to that end, actually. For green infrastructure planning that is already in process, what can community members do to push planning decision makers towards a more equitable approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the degree of process openness. So if they have set up, regular meetings or any sort of public comment period, is to really max out what can be done there. I know that's challenging if communities are resource strapped and things don't align with their schedules, and folks are often, kind of overburdened with other concerns. But I think that's a vital step for getting on the public record and just making it known that things, concerns aren't being taken into account, or that there are things that planners hadn't thought of that should be taken into account. If those opportunities don't exist, you're in a little bit more of a bind. But what we have seen with our work with the Anthropocene Alliance, that there are still successful avenues you can take, including petitioning, elected officials, really just making good trouble, as they say. So refusing to kind of be silent and get your concerns brushed aside. And that goes all the way to undertaking various forms of direct action. So I think it's finding ways to get on the public record, petitioning those who are given formal decision-making authority, finding creative avenues to take decision-making authority into your own hands, and really continuing to build like community organizing efforts to put those things on in the forefront of the process. Basically, don't give up is what I would say.
Great, thank you. We've got a question in the chat whether this is being recorded. This talk is being recorded and it will be posted to the Hudson River Watershed Alliance YouTube channel. Please share with others that you think would benefit from hearing this talk. And another question is asking if there are case studies published that we can access. So I know that there are a lot of links in the presentation that you shared. Once we post the recording, you can go back and take a look at those links, but are there case studies that are accessible to learn more?
There are a few that are out from this work. I can share those papers or links to those papers with you, Emily, after this. There's also one that's going to be published any day now, the one on definitions in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment. The proofs are finally going through the proof magic, and the other work is under review. So as that comes available, I can share that as well.
Great, thank you. That would be great. I'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone, so happy to link to any of those resources as well. What are some ways that planners can include community at more stages than just the initial community input? Can you give any examples of planning processes that have done this well?
Yeah, that's also a great question. The big things I think there are setting up like actual collaborative design processes, and that involves basically paying communities of experts to be engaged in design work to make sure that their needs are expressed. And design to me is not just project level, but it's also the design of the policies themselves as well as programs. Another really important thing is thinking through implementation, and that's especially important for the labor side of equity, is who's going to be involved in implementation. And there's a tremendous opportunity to build community wealth through upskilling and getting people much more deeply involved in implementation. And evaluation, I think, is the other big kind of under considered domain. And so there's a lot of good mechanisms out there for community-based evaluation of programs, policies, and projects, but those are not generally being used by cities right now. So the literature on community-based evaluation, I think, is very useful there for thinking through. And I know there's a turn towards, I know like NIFWIF and other funders are starting to get more interested in having communities evaluate the success of projects themselves. So I think we're going to see a pretty big change there in the coming years.
That's great, thank you. And we've got a question asking for the citation of the specific paper, Robinson et al. 2013 on co-production of ecosystem services. If you could share more information on that one, that would be great.
Sure.
Just a comment. One of the criticisms that I have heard for as long as I've lived in New York State is that our focus on home rule and local town planning processes has led to fractionated development. We don't plan as a region, we don't plan on a county level, we don't plan on a state level, we plan on a town level or a city and a village level. But I almost, flipping that around, I almost see that as precisely what you're advocating here, which is do the planning at the very bottom level and engage all the stakeholders and participants so that the locally desired outcome. I'm just wondering whether something that has been seen almost as a weakness in New York State could be a strength.
No, that's a great observation. I think there's a real tension there. And I kind of had that like appropriate scales little caveat where I think, so when we think about who's going to be impacted by planning, the larger the planning level, the more people are going to be impacted. And so I think you just increase the complexity of, community-based leadership for those regional planning exercises. So I think that's the real challenge is how do you have kind of local consent feed into larger scale consensus around what needs to be done. And we have the same problem in Connecticut around, and we've been involved like with the Council of Environmental Quality. That's a major challenge is interjurisdictional coordination for any sort of meaningful conservation planning. I don't want to say, everything should just be hyper-local, but I think we need to recognize that we need these bottom-up processes to be robust and intact to feed into larger scale decision making as well. And so that's kind of the challenge, is how do you do multi-scale governance in an actually equitable way? But yeah, I would agree that having robust town level planning and open democracy at the town level is certainly like a cornerstone for it. But drawing strong boundaries and saying that, oh, we can do whatever we want in this town, it's not going to affect someone in the next town, that's also fallacious. We need to recognize that one town's decision making will impact people downstream or who are ecologically connected or adjacent. So yeah, not the rugged individualist model of town planning, but the kind of a more open, multi-level collaborative approach, I think, is what we need.
Well said.
Yeah, my mayor here in Canton calls it the assumption that many towns have been working under is the filch model, that they're kind of competing against one another to attract commercial activity and attract development. And that has kind of led to a little bit of a race to the bottom. And many municipalities are kind of waking up to that, but they're eroding their own tax base and overextending their infrastructure. And they can't actually afford that model of development anymore.
Emily, you want to close us down?
Yeah, I think that brings us to time. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. We'll be posting the presentation and sharing resources as well with everyone who registered. So we hope to see you at our Watershed Planning Conference with some of these principles and practices hopefully front of mind as we're thinking through what a watershed planning process should be and look like and feel like. And hope to see you at the end of the month, and then for next month's breakfast lecture on November 18th.
Fantastic.
Well, yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll look forward to both of those.
Goodbye, everybody.